The 2023 fantasy football season is in the rear view. So today we're going to be breaking down our season review of the running back position specifically. We are probably going to do this for all positions, wide receivers, quarterbacks, and tight ends. We're going to go through basically the agenda of this video is we're going to take a redraft / best ball angle, reviewing the top 12 running backs in PPR, the top, the RB2s in PPR, the RB3s in PPR, kind of looking at the reason why these guys finished so highly. And then we're going to shift gears to kind of a dynasty focus and look at, the current state of the market and talk about the biggest risers and fallers from the 2023 season. And then finally talk about some lessons that we learned when evaluating this position going into next year and going into the dynasty offseason. Some hits, some misses. We'll eat some humble pie. Should be a fun video, just kind of taking a holistic view of the running back position. So before we get into the video, Danny, how you doing?
Doing well. And yeah, we're kind of known as the running back haters on this channel, where if a running back touches, 26, 27 years old, they are off our boards. But we'll have some fun with this. There's a lot of guys really spread out across your drafts, early rounds, mid rounds, late rounds, that will find their way on this video. And of course, as we always do, breaking down the top lessons to take into next year.
Yeah, for sure. So let's not waste any more time. If you enjoy, leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Now let's hit the intro. All right, so if you skip the intro, like I said, we're going to start by reviewing the RB1s from 2023. There was a lot of different variants with this position. There's some guys that drafted, early in the draft, like Christian McCaffrey, all the way up at 24.5 PPR points per game, an absolutely legendary season from him. But then the RB2 was a guy that wasn't drafted in most people's redraft leagues, was barely drafted in best ball leagues as well, with Kyren Williams. The RB3, Alvin Kamara, right smack dab in the middle of the RB dead zone. RB4, Raheem Mostert, again, another late round sleeper that a lot of people probably weren't expecting 17.8 PPR points per game out of. And then from 5 to 12, we have a mix of early round guys like ETN, Jahmyr Gibbs, Saquon, Joe Mixon, and then again, more dead zone dudes like Breece Hall, Rachaad White, Isaiah Pacheco, and David Montgomery. So, when you look at these top 12 running backs, is there anything that sticks out to you? Because, we're looking at this from a PPR standpoint. So the easy takeaway is that a lot of these guys catch the football.
Yeah, absolutely. They're archetypes. You look at guys like Jahmyr Gibbs. Obviously, Christian McCaffrey was always going to do it, but Alvin Kamara, Jahmyr Gibbs, Rachaad White, Saquon Barkley, even Joe Mixon to a degree this year. They're all guys that are catching upwards of 40-plus passes, and for some of them, catching upwards of 60-plus passes. So seeing that type of role really expand this year, because we don't typically have those bell cow type of running backs. Like we were talking off air, but back in the 2010s, back in the 2015s, you're looking at a landscape of 8 legit, 280 touch workhorse type of running backs. And because the landscape at running back doesn't look like that at this current point, those guys that can contribute in the passing game, which is more valuable compared to just raw rushing attempts, are going to be figuring up in the list compared to, like I said, maybe even 2012, 2016 type of years.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of running backs that are going to go over 300 touches in the NFL anymore. So the fact that you're getting these guys that have, 80-plus target upside, like we talked about, a lot of these dudes, we knew they had that type of upside. McCaffrey, Kamara, Travis Etienne, Jahmyr Gibbs, Breece Hall, these type of dudes, all contributing as pass catchers. One thing that I think sticks out to me is that you don't look at this list and think, oh, these were all just the starting running back for the best offenses in the NFL. Obviously, Christian McCaffrey and Raheem Mostert and, Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery, some of these guys played on really good offenses, but Alvin Kamara, Breece Hall, Rachaad White, even though Pacheco plays for the Chiefs, the Chiefs weren't an elite offense this year. Saquon Barkley also. A lot of these guys actually came from kind of like varying levels of offensive success in the NFL. So I don't think it's as easy as saying, oh yeah, draft good running backs from good offenses, because a lot of the times, a lot of these offenses weren't very good.
Yeah, no, completely agreed there. There's the instances, like you said, of the Alvin Kamara, of the Rachaad White, of Isaiah Pacheco, who coming into the year, if you were to say this exact role for the Kansas City Chiefs, and you said he finishes, the RB9 in fantasy, everybody would have assumed, okay, Patrick Mahomes is back. The weapons are looking really good, but he's kind of just been a one-man focal point of that Chiefs offense at this point. The passing attack has kind of regressed. Travis Kelce, not doing the same type of things that he was in previous years. Isaiah Pacheco's kind of been the fundamental piece of that Chiefs offense.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy to think too that like the Jets were the 29th scoring offense and the Giants were the 30th, and we got 2 top 10 running backs from this team, or from these teams. So pretty crazy when you look at the RB1s. Moving on to the RB2s, I think this is something that we also probably need to take away. And I've talked about this before when I broke down the archetypes of early round running backs, the trusty veterans, the breakout candidates, and some of the guys that are in their prime. This is, I think, where we need to just like contextualize. The trusty veterans are always going to lie in this area, right? Like James Conner, Derrick Henry, Josh Jacobs, Austin Eckler, Tony Pollard, these guys that are all, 25 plus years old coming into the season. When they miss, this is when they miss. Like they go Derrick Henry, RB14. You probably wanted more out of Derrick Henry when you drafted him, but he still was fine. He still gave you solid performances. He didn't kill you. He's not the reason you lost your fantasy league necessarily, but you missed out potentially on, the guys going in that area, Jahmyr Gibbs, Travis Etienne, Breece Hall, those type of dudes. So when I look at the RB2s, again, yeah, these were contributors to your fantasy team, but they came with varying levels of expectation. If you drafted James Conner and he was RB13 in points per game, that felt a lot better than Derrick Henry, who was RB14 in points per game here. It really all depends, and it definitely felt a lot better than Bijan Robinson, who was RB17 in points per game, who was a top 3 running back off the board. So when you're talking about like RB2 production, if you can get it from the mid to late rounds, that feels a lot better than having to get it from your early round studs.
Well, I mean, that's a fundamental principle of fantasy. It's all about opportunity cost. Like even going back up to the RB1s real quick, hitting on Kyren Williams and Raheem Mostert in the 12th round or the 15th round of your draft, hypothetically, was much more beneficial to your lineup, even aside from just pure PPR points per game, much more beneficial to your lineup than, say, hitting on Travis Etienne. Because let's just say you, instead of picking Travis Etienne, instead took a 3rd round wide receiver that smashed, a la a Keenan Allen type, and then you were also able to get a Kyren Williams or Raheem Mostert in that 15th round area. Well, now you're getting a surplus because you're getting a wide receiver 1 at wide receiver, and you're also getting an elite top 5 level running back. So even applying to the RB2s, that's why the magnitude of the hits is going to feel a lot better with a Jerome Ford type, a Zach Moss type, a guy that you picked up off the waivers versus you picked Derrick Henry at the 201 and he ended up with, what is that, 1.2 points per game more than Jerome Ford and 1.3 points per game more than Zach Moss, while also considering that you would know when to bench Jerome Ford and Zach Moss when Nick Chubb and Jonathan Taylor were on the field respectively. It really magnifies the what we have to prioritize when we're taking these running backs, like you said.
Yeah, I know for me specifically in my home league, one of the big decision points that I had in round 2 of my home league draft was Josh Allen or Tony Pollard. Josh Allen finishes the quarterback 1 in fantasy. Tony Pollard was probably one of the bigger regrettable picks in the first 2 rounds of fantasy drafts. So the fact that, I went with the right decision, I actually eventually ended up trading for Tony Pollard, but Josh Allen on the clock was the right decision there. This just kind of proves that sometimes running backs are not a good bet for early rounds. And I think Tony Pollard was one of the safer projections at running back in the early rounds. We'll talk about him later on in this video, so I'm not going to spoil that. But when you look at the RB2s, like these guys were either great for you because you got them late, or they were kind of just, guys that a lot of the biggest disappointments in fantasy are on this list right here as the RB2s.
Oh, yeah. No, for sure. I mean, it basically anybody with a green label next to them in the RB2 range is a disappointment, because if you're taking a running back, like you said, in the first 3 rounds of your draft, and they can't be an RB1, you're at a significant disadvantage. I mean, looking at the wide receiver landscape, I mentioned the name Keenan Allen. Let's just say at 201, you took Derrick Henry over CeeDee Lamb or Amon-Ra St. Brown. You're not going to be able to sleep at night.
Yeah, absolutely. And I forgot to mention this, but yellow meant that they were like kind of a dead zone mid-round pick. Yeah. Green meant they were an early round running back. And then red meant that they were a late round pick, round, 9+ or whatever of your draft, or potentially undrafted. So, and then when we look at the RB3s, you can see a lot of these guys had their moments this season. Like Jaylen Warren had games and stretches where he was a solid guy. Gus Edwards, had a stretch of games where he was just scoring touchdowns left, right, and center. Chuba Hubbard eventually took over that Carolina Panthers running back workload. Zeke had a bunch of good games. But none of these guys were like year over year RB1s or 2s. These are the types of guys that we always tell you, like, line your bench with in a hero RB or a 0 RB, because they can give you good weeks. And that's kind of most of these dudes. And if you guys are curious, if you see anybody here that's not that archetype, Ramondre, obviously he got hurt, but Najee Harris, Javonte Williams, Alexander Madison, these were some of the biggest busts in fantasy as well.
Yeah, absolutely. If you drafted a guy to accept this type of workload relatively high, He's a bust. I mean, like if you drafted the Jalen Warrens, the Gus Edwards, the Chuba Hubbards, you're only drafting them to fill in at spots in your lineup every now and then. They weren't every week type of starters. If you drafted Ramondre Stevenson in the first 3 rounds, he was an every week starter for you. Same thing with Najee Harris. Same thing with Javonte Williams. Same thing with Alexander Madison. You were drafting them to be every week starters, every week flex plays for your lineup. Whereas when you had short-term viability, short-term utility with some of these other running backs, like when Jalen Warren was expected to get more of a workload and you put him into your lineup, he was going to be an advantage for you. Same thing with a guy like Chuba Hubbard at the end of the year. Majority of the year, yes, he was working behind Miles Sanders and you weren't entering him in your lineup. But when you were entering in your lineup, he was getting 20 touches. He was getting an RB2 level workload. So with these type of players, with the RB3s, more so than the RB1s and 2s, we're not necessarily looking at the season in totality. We're more so looking at when they were utilized in your lineup, how much of an advantage really they were. And like I mentioned, guys like Chuba Hubbard, yes, it's a 10.7 point per game, but that's also factoring the games he was working behind Miles Sanders. And the games where he had the backfield to himself, that was typically when the only times he was even entering your lineup.
Yeah, exactly. So in a managed league, these were guys that you kind of knew when to start them and you knew when to not start them. I mean, Jalen Warren was a little bit different because he was kind of just like decently viable all season, but not spectacular in any given week. But then again, he also had the inherent upside that if Najee were to go down at any point, he would have been much better. It just didn't materialize. So let's move on to the advance rates, because this was taken from Best Ball Mania 4, which was obviously the biggest tournament in best ball, the biggest fantasy football tournament, period. This would have been a half PPR scoring setting instead of full PPR like we were just kind of looking at. But I just kind of wanted to gloss over some of the biggest advance rate players. So an average advance rate would be 16.6% because there was 12-man draft rooms. 8.3% would be your win rate. 16.6% would have been your advance rate because 2 out of every 12 guys advanced. So these were all of the running backs that provided you basically an advantage if you drafted them. They were above average advance rate players. Of course, Raheem Mostert providing the biggest advantage as a late round sleeper that posted a 40% advance rate. Same goes with Kyren Williams and Achane. Those guys were late round sleepers that eventually boomed and had, performances, top 12 type of performances, top 5 in some cases performances. And then Christian McCaffrey, ETN, Kamara, some of these guys were more higher drafted running backs that had good advance rates because, relative to where they were drafted, other players busted around them, and also the fact that they were pretty solid. So, I mean, when you look at this list of guys, what kind of stands out to you? Because the obvious answer is that if you were an early round guy with a high advance rate, you probably finished very highly. If you were a mid round guy, you probably returned a decent amount on ADP. And then if you were a late round guy that finished highly, you probably just had a lot of spike weeks and a lot of sleeper appeal, which is what the case was for most of these guys.
Well, what the data tells me here is that there's 6 guys that were taken in the first 3 rounds. What that tells me is if you took a running back in the first 3 rounds, a lot of them missed this year. A lot of them missed. So by hitting on one that actually did hit, like Travis Etienne didn't have a special year. We talked about Derrick Henry. He was going in the 2nd round, and yet he wasn't even an RB1 overall. But the fact that there were so many busts around those guys kind of lended itself to how it kind of materialized here. So Derrick Henry, despite being drafted probably as a top 8 overall running back in your league, he finishes the RB13, and yet he still has an above average advance rate. So I think part of that as well is if you drafted Derrick Henry, you were more likely to pair him with a guy like CeeDee Lamb, with a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown, because that was more so happening at the 1-2 turn. But that really opened my eyes where there's not a lot of running backs on this list that were drafted early. And the other takeaway I have is the prototypical dead zone didn't really look so dead this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to your point, Derrick Henry and Tony Pollard stick out as guys that probably had high advance rates because you paired them with CeeDee Lamb or AJ Brown or Amon-Ra St. Brown or, whatever other player was performing in that area. That's probably what inflated those advance rates. But yeah, the biggest takeaway I think has to be Kamara, Brian Robinson, Rachaad White, David Montgomery, James Cook, DeAndre Swift, Isaiah Pacheco, and Joe Mixon on Underdog specifically were all guys going in that round 4 through round 8 area that was traditionally called the running back dead zone. But all of these guys kind of gave you like mid RB2 or better type of numbers, in some cases RB1 numbers with Kamara and Rachaad White and some of those dudes. So yeah, I mean, the RB dead zone looks to be dead, at least in this year's configuration. A lot of those early round running backs didn't pay off on their own. It was pretty much just McCaffrey and ETN that gave you those kind of like solid advance rates themselves. And then the rest of the guys kind of came from that mid and late round area of the draft.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think we can move on to the below average advance rate type of players. And the takeaway here right off the bat is all of these late round guys, kind of have a correlation to why they're in this type of area. Because for starters, every single one of these guys has a teammate that was a higher advance rate type of player, which if you're drafting these guys, you're more than likely missing out on their teammates. For example, a guy like Jeff Wilson Jr., if you had Devon Achane or Raheem Mostert, two very, very productive players, if you were taking Jeff Wilson, you probably missed out on those guys.
Yeah, a lot of these guys are kind of contingent upside plays, right? Elijah Mitchell, if CMC has a monster year, Elijah Mitchell's not doing a whole lot. If Jerick McKinnon it isn't doing a whole lot, it probably means that Isaiah Pacheco had a good year, which is basically what happened here. So, I mean, the takeaway here is that anybody that's in red was pretty much just useless for fantasy, like for the most part. And even a guy like Zamir White, who eventually was useful, these are advance rates. So he actually wasn't useful for the entirety of the regular season, weeks 1 to 14. But then when Josh Jacobs got injured in the playoffs, he became useful. And then the other big takeaway here is there's a lot of busts from the early rounds, right? Ramondre Stevenson had a good stretch of the season from like week 5 to like up until he got injured, but he was really bad to start the year. Jonathan Taylor, he missed a bunch of games there, so that obviously hurt you. Nick Chubb, of course, he tore his ACL in week 2, so he was out for the entire season. But Austin Eckler and Bijan Robinson, probably the two most regrettable picks in the first round for a lot of people. When you're drafted in the first round as a running back and you don't achieve a 16, 18 point per game season at minimum, if not, better, like what Christian McCaffrey did, it's pretty hard for you to kind of return on that investment, which is why a lot of people, even in a half PPR scoring setting like Underdog, were taking wide receivers early. We're taking Travis Kelce early. We're taking a number of guys, even the quarterbacks in the first 2 rounds. So that is probably one of the bigger takeaways here is that, I mean, when you miss on an early round running back, it kills you.
Yeah, 100%.
I mean, very obvious takeaway. A lot of bad running backs here. Dalvin Cook, Miles Sanders, Cam Akers. I mean, some of these guys got hurt too, but like, if you're a good running back, traditionally, you're not going to be this bad. Eckler wasn't good this year. Bijan was good this year, but he got Arthur Smith and Jonathan Taylor. Like, a lot of the times it's just like, talented running backs are going to do well and untalented running backs are not going to do well. So I think we can kind of pivot off of like the redraft and best ball centric nature of this video. Let's talk about the state of the dynasty running back market, because there is a lot of discussion around like, who would be RB4 in Dynasty? Who would be RB5 in Dynasty? What does your top 12 look like? I think it's up for debate of the top 3 Dynasty running backs in some order. I think most people will have Jahmyr Gibbs, Breece Hall, or Bijan Robinson, unless they're like a staunch Christian McCaffrey redraft bro playing Dynasty. Maybe they have Christian McCaffrey up that high. But aside from those guys, there's a lot up for debate. For example, when you guys look at this Keep Trade Cut screenshot of the top 20 Dynasty running backs, if you include the first round picks, the mid first round area, meaning these running backs around this area are going for about a mid first round price tag, it ends at Travis Etienne. So after running back 8, which I would even argue potentially is too low for the first round price tags, I would probably take a mid first round pick for Travis Etienne in most cases. You're not really getting a whole lot of first round draft capital assets out of these running backs. And first round draft capital period ends at RB 13 here, which is like, even 2025 and 2026 first, we're talking about only 13 running backs being worth a first round pick in Dynasty. So it is a scarce landscape. There's not a whole lot going on. I don't know. What are some of the takeaways that you have from the Dynasty running back position?
Yeah. So the Dynasty running back position at this current point is really up in the air, like you said, because we're talking about the top 3 assets, in our opinion, both over on Flock, how we have them ranked. Bijan, Gibbs, Breece Hall as the guys that both have an elite ceiling right now, but also have the age working on their side, contract working on their side right now, where, Breece Hall is the oldest of that group and he hasn't turned 23 yet. So I think those are the guys that we feel safest about, maybe projecting, 2 more years of elite type of asset value. And then you get into the range of a lot more question marks. Do you value a guy like Christian McCaffrey there because he's going to give you the top end ceiling of fantasy, but also have the age concerns there, where if he has an RB5 season next year, he's probably dropping to the RB14 in Dynasty. That's inherently built into his cost. Same thing with a guy like Devon Achane. He's kind of the inverse. I would bet on this type of profile, but the concern there, of course, is that he split time with Raheem Mostert, did get banged up this year, so I don't quite think you can view him on the top tier of a Bijan, Gibbs, Breece Hall type of player. And then the biggest wild card, I think, is Kyren Williams, where my sentiment was always, they can add a running back and really ruin his workload. But at this point, with how he's played, 23 years old, I'd be shocked if they add a high-end investment at the running back position. Maybe they spend a 5th round pick, 6th round pick to take some of the blow off of him, but I feel really confident moving forward. And Kyren Williams was a guy that I really adjusted in my rankings. He was a guy that I was very tentative on at first, especially when he was more inefficient earlier in the season. But later in the season, he comes back from injury, really a lot more efficient of a player. I think he should be a second-team All-Pro running back at this point. Even if they add like a sixth-round pass catcher to this backfield, I think he should still be at the top of the running back rankings.
Yeah, it's very easy to just default to late round running back. This is James Robinson all over again. But I don't think it's that cut and dry. I don't think this is an obvious case of a guy being elevated by his workload and a guy just getting completely fed the ball, which is what happened. But he also was efficient at times. And he also plays for a good team that has a good quarterback. And there's no immediate guy that's going to come in and take his workload. If we had the 2020 running back class on the docket right now and Kyren Williams was in this position, then we'd be like, okay, there's 6 or 7 running backs that are going to go on day 2 of the NFL draft. That could really sink Kyren Williams' value. But that's not the case right now. Like, we'd be hard pressed to find any running back go in the top 64, 75 picks of the NFL draft. So if there's no real immediate threat outside of free agency, and we'll have to wait and see what happens there, then why are we not ranking Kyren Williams, a sub 24-year-old running back with an elite workload and 2 more years of team control, as a top 6 dynasty running back? So I think of the group here, he's definitely the hardest to rank because, you know, we don't know what the team commitment is. But if midway through his second season as the starter there, he's still doing what he did this year, then you could make the argument he's the RB3, RB4, RB5 in dynasty. And right now it's going to even look like a discount that we're getting him at. And I'm glad you mentioned Bijan, Breece, and Jahmyr Gibbs. My big takeaway here is that these guys need to be a solid first-round pick ahead of everybody else on the dynasty running back landscape in terms of market value. So if you value Travis Etienne, Jonathan Taylor, and these type of guys as like a mid to late first or a mid first in value, then you need to value Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall, and Jahmyr Gibbs as 2 mid firsts of value, because they're that much more valuable than those other guys because of those 2 to 3 years extra of age that you're getting. And in most cases, they're in a better contract situation where, you know, Bijan was a first-round pick. He's only played 1 year. He's got 4 more years of team control, plus they could franchise tag him or whatever the case. Same is true for Jahmyr Gibbs. And with Breece Hall, I mean, he was a second-round pick, so he doesn't have a 5th-year option, and he is going into his 3rd season, but you still get 2 more years of potentially elite running back production. He literally just finished as a top 6 running back in points per game. So with all 3 of these guys, I think if you have them in dynasty, like, this is the hero RB that you want for a competitive team.
Adding to that, it's so funny how zero RB, hero RB, avoiding the running back dead zone was so prevalent in redraft for as long as it did. I think it's far more applicable to dynasty now, where it's like, you want to take your hero in the first couple rounds, maybe take a Jahmyr Gibbs at the 211, a Breece Hall at the 211, or maybe I don't know, like, I think the cutoff would be like a Jonathan Taylor, Kyren Williams, maybe in the 3rd, 4th area. I think that's fine. I don't want to be touching the mid rounds of the running back position in my dynasty drafts. If I can, I want to be avoiding the Kenneth Walkers, the James Cookses, the Saquon Barkley, the Isaiah Pacheco, Tajay Spears. I really want to be avoiding the running backs in the 8 to 20 range, because it's kind of like they're propped up both on people thinking they can equate their market value moving forward with a workload. At that point, it's like, if I have an uncertain type of value retention here, let me just wait till the RB26 and grab James Conner if I'm just solely looking for production.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's going to be guys in that area that have youth and workload on their side that emerge too. Like Rachaad White, for example, was probably not going in the top 8 to 10 rounds of a dynasty draft. You probably got him in that 10th to 12th round area, and he's kind of all of a sudden jumped up. So the key, I think, is go with like a hero RB approach if you want to get an anchor running back, and then grab a bunch of those guys that can accumulate value like a Rachaad White, or just give you production, like you said, like a James Conner. A general rule of thumb too that I've noticed here is when you look at the guys that are underlined in red, these were like older running backs, Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs, DeAndre Swift, not an older running back necessarily, but guys that we didn't have a good long-term outlook of, because DeAndre Swift was only with the Eagles for 1 year, and we knew that coming into the season. If you don't produce, if you're not a top 6 dynasty or a redraft running back, or not a top, 15 plus point per game producer at least, it's pretty quick that you're going to fall down the board in dynasty value. And that's something that you definitely need to take into account when it comes to building your dynasty teams. Maybe you don't care about market value if you're a competitive team. You're like, I'm sacrificing market value inherently. I'm cool going out and trading for Saquon Barkley. I don't really care if 2 to 3 years from now he's not going to be very valuable. That's understandable. But at the same time, if you're trying to play the game of like walking the tightrope between good value and good production, you really need to be aware of once a running back turns 24, 25 years old, there is no such thing as value insulation anymore. They're only as good as their production. So their redraft and their immediate outlook in terms of situation, quarterback play, coaching, and all that stuff, it factors in way more than it does for a Jahmyr Gibbs or a Bijan Robinson.
Yeah, because I mean, for example, we have you circle the guys that are in the 25, 26, 27 range here. The two next guys that are coming here based off the rankings would be Jonathan Taylor and Travis Etienne. If neither of those guys finish as top 5 overall running backs, they're being ranked in the RB2 range of Dynasty rankings next year.
Yeah, absolutely. Same with Kenneth Walker, too, who actually is the RB9 in Dynasty. If he doesn't have a good season next year because Zach Charbonnet eats into his workload and takes away half the work, I mean, we're talking about him more so in the Najee Harris territory where he's splitting a backfield with a guy who's equally as talented, if potentially not more talented. So, I mean, there's a lot to tell. We could go on forever about the running back landscape. I think the things that you need to be focused on are the top guys are king. You hold on to those guys. If you're a competitive team, if you're a rebuilding team, they're the few running backs that you can both build a 1-year punt or a small retool around, and also build a monster contender with. And also once you get those, Kenneth Walkers, those Jonathan Taylors, those Travis Etiennes, remember that they're only as good as their, immediate outlook, because they're going to fall down the boards pretty quickly if they're not producing. And then the last thing, I'll let you get into this point, but I mean, we've seen this influx of talent at the young quarterbacks, right? We've seen CJ Stroud, Anthony Richardson, all these dudes come into the league the last couple of years. We know how good the wide receiver classes have been the last couple of years. And most recently, we got a lot of influx of talent at tight end this year too. The running back class, we just haven't seen that.
Yeah, and I mean, adding to that, right, it kind of feels like this is the generation now where people were told growing up, don't play running back. They're getting devalued. Go, like, the best athletes, go play wide receiver, go play quarterback, go play tight end. And that's materialized in terms of the gap in skill talent on the perimeter versus in the backfield in current days. Like, we're talking about when we grew up, for example, when we were super young, having running back stables of Adrian Peterson, the Frank Gores, like these really, really high-end running backs, legendary type of running backs. If we look in the NFL landscape right now, you're probably counting to maybe 3 to 5 current Hall of Famers at max. If we get there, like Christian McCaffrey, Derrick Henry are the two, and then maybe you're arguing guys like Alvin Kamara amongst a couple others. Like, the running back position just hasn't seen an influx of talent comparative to the other positions. Like, we're talking about guys like James Cook, Rachaad White, Isaiah Pacheco, Javonte Williams. We're talking about them as potential, top 12 to 15 overall dynasty assets, when realistically, if this was 2013, there may be back-end RB2s in terms of value.
Well, not even just going back that far, but going back to 2019. Think about 2019. We would have had those 2017 running backs, the Kamaras, the Fournettes, the Christian McCaffreys, all those type of dudes, in addition to the 2018 class of Saquon Barkley, Nick Chubb, and all those guys that came out. That was the peak. That was, when the Dynasty RB12 was a very good asset still. And now it's like Dynasty RB12 is what, like James Cook? Like, we're in a position now where we're like valuing mid and low end RB2s as back end RB1s because we simply just don't have the horses at this position anymore. And if one guy in the 2024 class, Travion Henderson, for example, gets top 2-round draft capital, he's going to be a top 8 Dynasty running back, even if he doesn't deserve maybe to be that highly ranked.
It's kind of been the inverse now, where we talked about for a while, you want to get the wide receivers, and I still believe that as a basic principle, especially when you're not competing. You don't want a position that's inherently going to outproduce, but when you're starting to compete now, the biggest advantage you can have is having elite running backs, because there aren't many. Like, the scarcity factor is absolutely a thing. And I think this applies more so to Dynasty than redraft, because people will, base their redraft strategies off of getting these early round running backs because it's quote unquote scarce. I more so look at the market in Dynasty as being scarce, where I'm more willing now to pay the piper on a top end running back than I would have even in 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we simply don't have that many anymore. And that's what you're kind of talking about. It's this offseason. If I'm trying to build out a contender, I've, determined, I've evaluated my draft room. I'm thinking, hey, it looks like these guys are going to be going for youth. It looks like maybe it's going to be beneficial to me to maybe try and compete in this league. I'm going to probably prioritize drafting a stud running back over a mid-end wide receiver one, so that I can get that hero, get that advantage, knowing that I can grab tons of contending wide receivers in the 30, 40, and even wide receiver 50 range. Like, you're going to be able to get Amari Cooper, Mike Evans, Tyler Lockett, guys like that way later on in your draft. And you can get those guys at running back as well. But the anchor running backs that are young, that have projectable volume, projectable upside for the next 3 to 4 years, there is 3 names in Dynasty.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. But we can move on now to the hits and misses, really micro dissect this. But the big hit that I found from fantasy this year, and particularly in the Best Ball Mania tournament, hence the winning team being able to take it down, is 0 RB, hero RB were the absolute ways to go. And that's kind of evidenced by the fact that outside of Christian McCaffrey, there weren't too many running backs that actually paid off that you took in the first 2 rounds. Putting aside the fact that, of course, like I said, Best Ball Mania 4 winning team, $3 million wasn't a 0 RB team. If you're going light at running back in general this year, then you were able to stack up a lot of these league winning type of players in the rounds 8 to 15 area, the Kyren Williamses, the Raheem Mosterts. Instead of taking, let's just say 1 or 2 running backs, two running backs in the first 2 rounds, while missing out on guys like Kamara, guys like CeeDee Lamb, some of those other high-end producing wide receivers. If you only took 1 running back or 0 running backs, then there were a ton of running backs that paid off later in the drafts, evidenced by the graphic that we shared.
Yeah, and even if you ventured into the dead zone, I mean, you could have grabbed an Isaiah Pacheco or Rachaad White or somebody like that. And I mean, it's very clear that any strategy will come down to who you selected. Like, because if you went hero RB and you took Tony Pollard, it probably didn't work out very well. But if you went hero RB and you took ETN or you took Christian McCaffrey, that probably worked out. Or if you went 0 RB and you avoided early round running backs altogether and went AJ Brown, CeeDee Lamb at the 1-2 turn, it probably worked out for you very well. So the goal, and I would say the hit that we're talking about here, and the thing that we're claiming, is that we're telling you guys what we were talking about in the summer was go light at running back early, whether it's 0, whether it's 1, whether it's a double hero, and make sure you hammer out the late area of the RB dead zone. That run at around 8 area, you could still get your Brian Robinsons, your James Cooks, some guys like that. Maybe Isaiah Pacheco would slip there at some times, and grab Jalen Warren, Chuba Hubbard, Raheem Mostert, Devin Singletary, those type of guys in the late rounds, because you churn the waiver wire, you drop the guys that don't work for you, and you pick up the guys that do. And that would have probably resulted in you being very high on, say, Kyren Williams or a Jerome Ford early on in the waiver cycle too.
Yeah, well, I mean, given the market at running back, I feel like this really exemplifies the theory of running back selectivity, where we're analyzing all the factors, we're analyzing just the magnitude of the hit and whether or not it's a worthwhile pick. We've talked about it all offseason, last offseason, and it's really shown itself that outside of maybe Christian McCaffrey, a lot of these guys definitely fell flat in their face, even some guys that we're all over.
Yeah, like we're going to talk about Pollard here in a second, but one of the misses here, because the concept and the theory of go light at running back early and draft a lot of them late was valid. But the thing that was not valid specifically this year was avoiding the running back dead zone, because as we already talked about, some of the highest hit rate running backs actually came from the running back dead zone.
Tons of studs in this area, from guys like Breece Hall, Rachaad White, Isaiah Pacheco. Like, if you're looking through this and you're seeing between RBs 14 and 32 in terms of how they were selected, it's about a half-half whether you were hitting or missing, which typically is not the case in the running back dead zone. You're expected to miss far more often than you hit in the running back dead zone. But we saw in 2023, you took Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, Jonathan Taylor, Rachaad White, James Conner, Alvin Kamara, DeAndre Swift, James Cook, Isaiah Pacheco, David Montgomery. These were all winning players for your lineup.
Yeah, and at points in the year, like when we were doing our rest of season rankings and stuff like that, there was points in the year where I thought Kenneth Walker was going to be a top 8 running back for the rest of the year, even if he didn't finish as strong as he thought. So knowing how we play fantasy football, we're going to trade players like that if we think they're overvalued. So knowing that all these guys had a moment in the sun, had a point in time where we were like, they're elite every week starters. That's crazy that a lot of these guys came from the running back dead zone, because that typically does not happen. And for what it's worth, I mean, Breece Hall, Jonathan Taylor probably wouldn't have been in the dead zone if they were healthy coming into the year, and we knew that. But at the same time, like you said, it's usually you hit on 30% of these guys, not 50%. We got a higher than average hit rate in the dead zone, and I think it's mainly due to sites like Underdog Fantasy pushing down the ADP of a lot of these running backs. We don't typically see a dead zone running back anymore, like a Mike Davis or like, Miles Sanders or Alexander Madison. There's not as many of those guys anymore as there used to be.
Well, I mean, if we're just doing the math, right, the amount of running backs selected now in the 2023 drafts compared to, say, running back selected in 2020, running back selected in 2021, you were seeing, your RB12 go off the board within the first 16, 17, 18 picks back then. Whereas nowadays, because of sharp drafters coming in, pushing the ADP of those running backs down, that would explain the viability of so many of these running backs that would typically be top 3-round picks going more so now in the round 5, round 6, round 7 range.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of like the whole strategy that we talked about. We talked about it in our hero RB videos, our zero RB videos, our double hero RB videos. The strategy of going light at running back worked. The strategy of avoiding the dead zone did not work. We need to definitely make sure that we're evaluating these players and their situations and their merits individually, which I think we did definitely mention. But at the same time, like, the strategy of avoiding the dead zone altogether is no longer viable. We're starting to see a lot more sharp players venture into the dead zones for the right profiles. Like, don't just venture in for anybody. Don't venture in for Alexander Mattison and Miles Sanders because you need a running back that's going to get volume. Venture in there for Rachaad White because you took Christian McCaffrey in round 1 and you want an upside swing for your RB2 slot. That's how you do it properly.
It's kind of gone from a dead zone where no matter what, if you enter in, like, you were most likely leaving it, to kind of like a minefield now where you're playing a game where there's mines every now and then in this field. But if you can step on a clear spot, you potentially get a difference making running back.
Yeah, it's like a boomer bust zone now instead of the dead zone, basically. So couple hits and couple misses here from a micro player take standpoint. My guys, if you guys recall, we did a video called our My Guys before the season. My two My Guys at running back were one of my biggest hits and one of my biggest misses, which is Breece Hall as the biggest hit and Bijan Robinson as the biggest miss. So with Breece Hall, I mean, he bucked the ACL trend narrative because, as you know, Dr. Edwin Porras and some of the other guys talked about, it's not a black and white avoid all running backs come off of ACL tears, because if a running back is young, if he's athletically elite, which Breece Hall is, and he was a high draft capital guy with a good projection, he has a much better chance of breaking the narrative to, say, Javonte Williams, for example, who's not as good of an athlete as Breece Hall, who didn't have as good of a projection in terms of his offense coming into the year. Obviously, Breece didn't have Aaron Rodgers and still finished elite, which is absolutely amazing. But it took him about a couple weeks to ramp up as well. So Breece Hall was a big time hit in terms of totality of the regular season. But, you know, September 27th, it probably didn't feel that way. So you just had to be patient with Breece Hall. And then my biggest miss absolutely has to be Bijan Robinson. If you told me going into the season that he would have tied with Christian McCaffrey and Breece Hall for the highest target share in the NFL at running back, I would have flipped out preseason. I would have still been drafting him as high as I was. What I didn't expect was the 8th overall pick in the draft to have the 41% of his team's carries, which ranked 26th among all running backs. Thank God Arthur Smith is gone. I'm not just going to put this all on Arthur Smith and say, absolve myself of all blame for telling you guys to draft, you know, Bijan Robinson over Christian McCaffrey, because obviously that was incorrect. And Christian McCaffrey absolutely should have been the pick at RB1 over Bijan Robinson. But I would still spend a top 6 to 8 draft pick overall on this profile. If we simulated this season 50 times, yes, this was one of the absolute worst case scenarios that happened. And Bijan was still electric on his touches individually, but the overall totality of his fantasy season was like 15 PPR points per game in games where he didn't have a headache, which definitely is not what you signed up for when we told you to draft this guy top 6, top 8 in your drafts as the RB1 off the board.
Now, with that being said, everything from a talent perspective I could have possibly seen from Bijan Robinson this year, he passed in spades. And if there's any depressed cost, like maybe he's the top of the second round in a lot of your drafts next year because people were burned about him this year, skip the value, because like I feel more confident now knowing that he can do that in the NFL moving forward, and with a competent coach and he's getting 20 plus touches per game. I think it's almost a certainty that he bounces back into a top 5 to 8 running back.
Yeah, and I'll talk about that in a second because there is a takeaway that would apply to him next year. So one more hit and miss here from you. We got one of the hits was, we kind of already touched on this, but the volume is king merchants, the minefield of the dead zone. Miles Sanders, Alexander Mattison, Najee Harris. That was a hit for us. We were not on those guys at all.
And the way I kind of break this down is when you're late in your draft and you could potentially find projectable workload, you want to take it then. Later in your draft, rounds 10, rounds 11, rounds 12, rounds 13. If you're taking that in the mid rounds based off somebody that, oh, he may not be efficient, but he should get 200, 250 touches, those are the guys we got to stay away from, because what we are worst at as fantasy football players is projecting year-to-year workloads from players that aren't very talented. I mean, we're talking about some of these guys like Miles Sanders, like Alexander Mattison, like Najee Harris, that were getting propped up in some spots because they got the projectable workload. The offense should be better. we are hearing a ton of excuses for these guys. And for what it's worth, they did have some of their bright spots. Like at some points earlier in the year, Miles Sanders kind of looked some decent. Alexander Madison at some points looked like the bell cow for the Vikings. Najee Harris finished strong, but in totality, these were losing bets. Where you were taking them versus where they ended up materializing, not only in terms of running back ranking, but in terms of some of the guys that finished ahead of them that went later on, is pretty concerning, right? Volume is king in theory, yes, but when you aren't very good, others will change that backfield volume. We've seen, for example, Miles Sanders, Chuba Hubbard taking over the role. For example, Alexander Madison, Ty Chandler working in at the end of the year. And then obviously Najee Harris with Jaylen Warren in his side throughout the entirety of the 2023 season. They all split touches, and with split touches, they weren't efficient enough players to be able to be winning plays.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I'm glad we spotted the mines that we did. I think we were almost exactly correct on who were the mines in the dead zone. What we should have been better at was maybe going after the guys that weren't mines, that actually had decent projections. Yeah. And I did get some shares. Like I had a decent amount of Isaiah Pacheco on Underdog. I had a decent amount of Rachaad White on Underdog, but I actually wish I was a little bit more aggressive because those guys were better projections even than I initially thought. One of the biggest misses for you, for me, for pretty much anybody that like had a good process, because the process led you to Tony Pollard has legendary upside, and he did not have legendary upside this year.
And what's baffling is you're looking at the peripheral still. The number one scoring offense in the NFL, the Dallas Cowboys. A good offensive line. 2 guys voted into the All-Pro team. Obviously, the way Dak Prescott was playing, arguably a top 2 to 3 MVP candidate. CeeDee Lamb having the year that he has. Like this offense should have been a gold mine for Tony Pollard, but unfortunately, whether it was him coming off of that fractured tibia in the San Francisco 49ers loss in the postseason last year, maybe a slow ramp up, maybe him just not being able to carve up that level of efficiency from last year with a heightened workload, we can make every excuse in the book. The bottom line here is that Tony Pollard was a bust because he simply was not a good enough player to be an RB1 despite the circumstances. Like I think honestly, there's a lot of other running backs in the landscape that if you were to drop in this spot would have been high-end advance rate players, would have been 16, 17, 18 plus point per game players. So the fact that Tony Pollard was a sub 15 point per game projection, despite being the unquestioned number 1 running back on the Cowboys with how good they were offensively, is really concerning. Again, we kind of listed it here, but it's either A, he can't handle the workload and keep up the efficiency that he saw prior, or B, that fractured tibia really goes into plan, because trying to evaluate what went wrong aside from those 2 factors, it's honestly impossible. I really can't point to one single thing. He got the receiving workload. He got the inside the 5 usage. He got everything we could have possibly expected. He just didn't play well enough.
Yeah, and I don't know if that makes him a buy or a sell right now. Like
I can't tell.
Because I'm like, is he just going to be healthier next year and that's going to be good? Because, I mean, he also is a free agent, but keep that aside. Let's say he was back with Dallas. Like, let's say they kept him on a 2-year deal, like a short-term deal or whatever. I don't know what the hell I would do with Tony Pollard, because I'm like, is he just suck now, or is he like healthy in 2024?
And I think part of it, like contextually as a Cowboys fan, was the change in offensive line coach going to Mike Solari from Joe Philbin did play a role. Certain techniques being taught with Solari that weren't taught with Joe Philbin led to some unfamiliarity in terms of the run scheme for the Cowboys. So I think that was a factor. Like, for example, in the game against the Lions, I believe he had 49 rushing yards and 46 of them were after contact. So I think part of it was the offensive line not playing as well. Part of it, different run scheme up front with Mike Solari. Part of it, just Tony Pollard being an inferior player. But there are really cases that we can't project year to year because it's kind of variance, man. We can't predict this type of stuff.
Yeah, I honestly want to just throw Tony Pollard's season out and say that we should absolutely take nothing away from it. Maybe keep more track of this like tibia surgery if it happens to any other players. But other than that, man, like I would bet on this profile every single time.
Or maybe the other thing is if a player who's a backup for a few years, it's tougher to just project them into the full workload. I think that may be a little bit of a takeaway too. Like, for example, if Najee Harris were to walk next year and Jaylen Warren kind of had the Tony Pollard type of steam, maybe that's a takeaway.
Yeah, that would make some sense as well. But I think we've also seen other running backs get more work and be better than what Tony Pollard at least showed on the field. So yeah, definitely a tough situation, but probably one of the bigger misses in fantasy. A couple hits and misses as well here. We got betting on volume increases for young running backs. I think this one's really crucial, and it also applies to Bijan because we just talked about this. But 6 of the top 9 running backs were either rookies, Jahmyr Gibbs being the only rookie, second or third year running backs, ETN being the only third year running back, but he was basically a second year running back because he missed his entire rookie season.
Frank.
Kyren Williams, Breece, Rashad White, and Isaiah Pacheco were all second year running backs as well. All these guys kind of experienced big upticks in volume from year 1 to 2 or year 2 to 3 in ETN's case. James Cook, Bijan, Kenneth Walker, and Brian Robinson, also inside the top 20 running backs, were either rookies, second year or third year running backs as well. So that's half of the top 20 that experienced kind of big volume upticks from being a rookie to a second year player to a third year player. So something we definitely should continue to swing for in the future. When we're projecting players and we're trying to figure out who's going to get more receiving work this year than they got the year before, or who's going to get more inside the 5 work or whatever, if you're doing that, it should be for a young running back. It should be for a second-year running back going into his third year, a first-year running back going into his second year. It's not a perfect process. Of course, this would have led you to draft a lot of Dameon Pierce, for example, and he definitely did not see an increase in workload. And it also would have led you to draft a lot of Javonte Williams as well. But at least this process would have kept you from drafting Alexander Mattison, Miles Sanders, and Cam Akers.
Yeah, absolutely. And a quick note on Javonte. It's so tough. It's so tough for me because if you were to tell me coming into the year that he had 217 carries and 47 receptions, I would have drafted him 100% of spots. But the fact is he was less efficient of a player, and we just couldn't project something like that. So typically, like you said, very, very good process betting on young players getting backs. I mean, you can even transfer that to trade targets in season. There was a time where you could have gotten Jahmyr Gibbs for 20% of his cost by the end of the year. Like, it was really ridiculous. People were valuing him as, is he a top 24 running back in the redraft landscape? Is David Montgomery better than him? Like, there was a lot of questions come week 5, week 6. And at least I know I was holding pretty constant that if I can get access to this type of elite profile, I want him for my tail end of my fantasy football season. I want him for the week 13, the week 14, the playoff weeks, because I know the level of upside there, and baking in the fact that if he gets more of a workload, you can look at a league winner, which he ended up materializing into.
Yeah, I think in week 7 or week 8, we had a trade targets video, and my adamant guy that I was targeting was Rashad White, and yours was Jahmyr Gibbs. So hopefully you guys watched that video, because they were pretty much nuts after that video came out. And we were looking, we're like, hey, workload's there. You know, for you, it was like, we're projecting a rookie running back to get better as the season goes along. For me, I was just like, dude, Rashad White literally has like the second best workload in the NFL. Like, he would have to be horrible not to produce on this workload going forward. And obviously he got better, and they started using him more as a receiver. A couple guys that we did miss on, Joe Mixon and Alvin Kamara. These two guys were veteran running backs. When you look at the age that those guys had coming into the season, the lack of efficiency the year before as well, we had kind of seen that both of them had fallen off a little bit. We weren't exactly sure if they would continue to produce in fantasy. I think this is one of those situations where you look at both of these guys, and Alvin Kamara, I mean, he finished RB3 in points per game. So that's egg on my face big time, because I barely drafted Alvin Kamara on best ball drafts, and I never drafted him anywhere else. And Joe Mixon was RB12 in points per game, which didn't kill you. But I mean, he didn't have Joe Burrow and he was RB12 in points per game. He probably would have been a top 8 running back had Burrow stayed healthy and played well.
Yeah, I mean, adding to that, so Alvin Kamara, I got a lot more shares of, because there was a time in best ball where he was going in the round 9 to 13 area. So I was taking advantage when he was that low, but I still was fading him when he was a 6th round pick, 5th round pick, which, looking back now that he was the RB3, definitely ends up being a miss. And then with Joe Mixon, I mean, he was one of my top 5 busts entering the year. I did not want Joe Mixon, even with the knowledge that Joe Burrow would be there. So the fact that he ended up being as good as he was, definitely one of the few cases of the old running back trusty workload ended up working out for him.
Yeah, I'm really not sure what the takeaway is from these guys. Like, do you have a tangible takeaway other than like, hey, these guys were maybe just a misappropriation of talent evaluation on our part? Like, they were just better than we thought. Like, I thought they were washed, both of them. I was like, these guys, like, you know, I thought there was a possibility that Chase Brown would take over the backfield at some point. I thought there was a possibility that one of Jamal Williams or Kendre Miller would take over the backfield at some point. So for me, when I look at these two guys, I'm like, this is volume is king the right way, is the way I look at this. Volume is king the right way kind of means like, he's the most talented back in his backfield, which of course, maybe we just didn't know that coming into the season. He's a sturdy veteran. He has a big contract and a lot of pull with the team. Whereas volume is king the wrong way is like, well, there's nobody else in the backfield. Like, that's the wrong way of volume is king. At least these guys had a track record of multi-time RB1 finishes.
My only caveat there is even these type of profiles, They're not great to bet on overall from a macro perspective, but you will have the minor variance spots where they do hit. Like, let's just say this is the 2 out of 20 such profiles we see this year actually end up materializing. Maybe not 20 plus, maybe like 12, but regardless.
Yeah, well, I mean,
like,
Eckler and Derrick Henry were probably the opposite of this, where like they finished a lot worse than where they were going, and they were similar bets. They were both, all of them like veteran running backs who had been productive in the past. Aaron Jones also falls into this category, but he got injured, which is also a risk with these guys. So there's not much to take away. If there's 6 guys like this every single year, one of them might burn you heavily. One of them will probably be okay and just fine. And then 2 of them will be kind of disappointment slightly. And then 2 of them will just outright bust and be terrible. That's the takeaway from this type of profile, is that it's just, you don't know really what you're getting.
Yeah. And I mean, moving on to guys that did hit, we just talked about, kind of 2 dead zone type of guys. Joe Mixon, kind of like a 4th rounder in a lot of home leagues. Alvin Kamara, more so a 5th, 6th round pick, although those were both expensive in our opinion. Moving on, though, the late round guys, one of the hits that we had was Raheem Mostert, a guy that appeared on your Sleepers video, a guy that I myself was drafting a ton on Underdog. Really high thoughts about the Miami Dolphins offense. Love the speed factor with Raheem Mostert. Devon Achane entering the year unhealthy led me to drafting a lot of Raheem Mostert in my Underdog drafts. And the thought process here was no real competition for this offense. Jeff Wilson already banged up coming into the year. Like I mentioned with Devon Achane dealing with some preseason issues. You were projecting potentially an RB1 workload on one of the best offenses in the league for short-term viability. And that was really only the play why I led to Raheem Mostert. It's not like I was saying this 32-year-old injury-prone running back is going to be a guy that leads my team for the next 15, 16, 17 weeks in this fantasy football season. This is more so like, okay, I'll draft this guy in round 11. He'll help sturdy my backfield while maybe my Breece Hall or my, Travis Etienne really ramp up to speed. And then by then, he's probably just going to be a high upside type of piece, high contingency type of piece for this Miami backfield. I didn't expect him to have the type of year, the near 18 PPR points per game that he had for the amount of games that he did.
Yeah, exactly. The reason I was drafting Raheem Mostert is because I was drafting a lot of Breece Hall, Javonte Williams, and Jahmyr Gibbs. Like, that's why I was drafting Raheem Mostert. And it worked out for the entirety of the season, not just for the first 3 to 5 games like I thought I was getting out of Mostert, until Devon Achane kind of worked into the backfield and I thought Jeff Wilson would work in. But yeah, the takeaway here is, like, why would I draft projectable volume for the Carolina Panthers in round 5 with Miles Sanders when I can draft projectable volume with the Miami Dolphins in round 12 for a better running back also in Raheem Mostert? It's like the difference there was like we were trying to project some huge workload onto Miles Sanders that he had never commanded.
And I think we both were under the agreement that the Miami Dolphins backfield was just mispriced. And if you were under that same agreement and you were personally valuing the Miami running backs higher than consensus, 2 out of those 3 guys ended up being big time booms with Devon Achane, with Raheem Mostert. The only miss there would have been Jeff Wilson, which if you're telling me I have a 67% hit rate on potentially getting a league winning caliber player, I'm taking that risk every single time on potentially landing on Jeff Wilson.
Yeah, and also that also required Raheem Mostert not missing a game until week 17, which none of us probably expected to happen. Jeff Wilson would have had more viability had Mostert missed time, which was kind of a expectation at the time there. The other side of the coin of the hits and misses of the late rounds is that we weren't even, like, Kyren Williams wasn't even on my radar coming into the season. And we were off Cam Akers, which is something that should have maybe led us more to Kyren Williams. But the guy that we were thinking of was probably Zach Evans. And the takeaway here is that we've talked about it multiple times. And I literally put this like mistakes to let your like idiot league mates make. It's one of the highest viewed videos on this channel. One of the things that I talked about was making yourself right twice. So if you're going to fade a player, say we were going to fade Miles Sanders, which is what we were doing, I was taking a lot of Chuba Hubbard for that reason, because part of the reason is, hey, Miles Sanders doesn't work out, maybe Chuba Hubbard does. And that's exactly what happened. I'm fading Najee Harris. I'm going to draft a lot of Jaylen Warren. But you got to stay consistent. If you're fading Cam Akers, which we were, you got to draft a little bit of Kyren or a little bit of Zach Evans.
Yeah, and I mean, mixing in there, I think the concern was, what was the level of Matthew Stafford's health? What was the level of the offensive line play? Kyren himself being more inefficient. But it comes back to the concept of opportunity cost. If this guy was going to be in the last round of all of your drafts, and you were as staunchly as against Cam Akers, I was as staunchly against Cam Akers as we were, well, then you should have been taking Kyren Williams, because as we know, Matthew Stafford still a Super Bowl level quarterback. Sean McVay still a Super Bowl level coach. Basically, the only bet you're making at that point is you're expecting Cam Akers to fall off, maybe cede opportunity to a guy like Kyren Williams. Your only bet you have to make is, can Matthew Stafford stay healthy? And can Sean McVay lead the offense if Matthew Stafford is healthy? And we saw, obviously, the Rams, especially down the stretch, being one of the top 5 or so offense in the league. Puka Nacua, we'll talk about in the wide receiver video, but big proponent of that as well. This offense looks as good as it did in 2021 when it won the Super Bowl.
Yeah, I think part of it is just being lower on the Rams in general.
Yes.
But also to Kyren Williams, even on like after week 1, when we saw him perform at a high level in week 1 and he was one of the higher waiver ads, I still wasn't really that in on Kyren Williams, because even though I didn't really like Cam Akers, I was like, oh, is this going to be a split backfield? How good is this offense actually going to be? I should have been like, hey, I wasn't high on Cam Akers, and this Kyren Williams guy already popped up in week 1. Maybe that's a sign of things to come. That's what I should have thought. And like literally that week, they like said Cam Akers is not the starter anymore. It's Kyren Williams. And then they traded Cam Akers within like a couple weeks.
Yeah, no, completely agree there.
Yeah. So there was a lot in this video. It was a longer video, but we basically reviewed the entire landscape of the running back position in 2023. Redraft takeaways, best ball takeaways, dynasty takeaways, whatever you guys got from this video. If you enjoyed it, leave a like down below. Subscribe to the channel if you're new. Do you want to see this for wide receivers, quarterbacks, and tight ends? We intend to do it at least for wide receivers, but we will probably do it for quarterbacks and tight ends if you guys want to see that as well. And if you're new around here, if this is the first time you're checking us out and you like that we're kind of being transparent with what we got right and what we got wrong, leave us a subscription down below. If you want to check out any of our bonus content, head on over to flockfantasy.com. Promo code FSE gets you 30% off. We are dropping our pass catcher rankings 6 through 10 today. So if you want to hear about Xavier Worthy and Adonai Mitchell and some of the guys that we didn't cover in that first video, you can definitely start your free trial 7 days for free over there on Flock Fantasy and see that video. Make sure to check out all the value, the Superflex rankings, one quarterback, all that stuff when you guys are signed up over there. But with that being said, peace out, and we'll talk to you soon.